June 1942, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a deceptively peaceful sky. The Imperial Japanese Navy was unstoppable. Their carriers had brought America to its knees at Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were the finest in the world. Victory seemed inevitable, certain, absolute. But in the space of 5 catastrophic minutes, everything changed. When Admiral Yamamoto received the radio transmission, when he read those terrible words, his hands began to tremble. The color drained from his face like water from a shattered vessel. What he said next would echo through the corridors of Japanese naval headquarters, and what Tokyo Command decided to do about it would seal the fate of millions. This is the story of the words they spoke, and the lies they told, and the secret they buried for 3 long years. June 4, 1942. 10:22 in the morning. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood motionless on the bridge of the carrier Akagi. Through his binoculars, he could see his fleet spread across the ocean like a steel constellation. 4 magnificent aircraft carriers: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These weren't just ships. They were the sword and shield of the Japanese Empire. The very same vessels that had humiliated the American Pacific Fleet 6 months earlier. The morning had started with confidence bordering on arrogance. Japanese pilots were preparing to launch another devastating strike against the American base on Midway Island. Victory was so close Nagumo could taste it. Then the sky opened up. American dive bombers, Douglas SBD Dauntlesses, dropped out of the sun like falling stars. Nagumo's air defenses had been caught in the worst possible position. His fighters were at low altitude. His carriers' decks were crowded with fully fueled aircraft and armed torpedoes. The Americans couldn't have chosen a more perfect moment if they'd planned it for years. The first bomb struck the Akagi at 10:26, then another, and another. Within 60 seconds, the flagship was transformed into a floating inferno. Aviation fuel ignited like liquid sunshine. Torpedoes cooked off in massive secondary explosions. Men were thrown overboard by the concussive force or burned where they stood or drowned in the machinery spaces below. 2 minutes later, the Kaga erupted in flames. 90 seconds after that, the Soryu began its death spiral. Nagumo watched it all happen. His face registered no emotion, no anger, no fear, nothing. One of his staff officers, Commander Oishi, later wrote in his private journal that the admiral's expression resembled a man watching his own children being murdered before his eyes, knowing he is powerless to save them. The bridge fell into a haunted silence. Radio operators listened to the screaming chaos on their headsets but couldn't form words to report what they heard. Junior officers looked to their superiors for orders, for guidance, for anything. But Nagumo said nothing. He simply stood there, watching the black pillars of smoke climb toward heaven, as if the sky itself were mourning Japan's fortune. By the time the sun touched the western horizon that evening, all 4 carriers had been destroyed. The most powerful naval strike force ever assembled, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the instrument of Japan's domination of the Pacific, gone. So, burning, scattered across the ocean floor. In 5 minutes of American fury, Japan had lost what it could never replace. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in the operations room of the battleship Yamato, 300 miles northwest of the carnage, completely unaware that his world was ending. He was 58 years old, a strategic genius, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had gambled everything on carrier warfare while others still worshipped battleships. He had studied at Harvard. He had traveled America extensively in the 1920s. He understood his enemy better than any officer in the Japanese military, and that knowledge, that deep, uncomfortable understanding, had filled him with dread from the very beginning. At 12:30 in the afternoon, a young radio operator approached Yamamoto with a message flimsy in his trembling hand. The operator's face was pale. He could barely make eye contact with Japan's greatest naval commander. Yamamoto took the paper. Read it once, then read it again. Akagi heavily damaged by enemy dive bombers. Listing to starboard. Uncontrollable fires throughout the ship. The admiral's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He handed the message back to the operator. "Confirm this," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but those who knew him best could hear something underneath the calm. Something cold and final. 23 minutes later, another message arrived. Kaga sinking. Soryu abandoned. Hear you under sustained attack. Witnesses in the operations room. Officers who had served with Yamamoto for years noticed his hands beginning to shake, just slightly, just enough to see. Without a word, Yamamoto turned and walked toward his private cabin. His footsteps echoed down the corridor. He entered the room, closed the door behind him, and for the next 3 hours the greatest naval commander in Japanese history remained locked inside alone with the terrible mathematics of defeat. Some officers claimed they heard him speaking through the door, not shouting, not cursing, just talking, having a conversation with someone who wasn't there, or perhaps with someone who had always been there. The ghost of the future he had always feared. When Yamamoto finally emerged at 4 p.m., his uniform was immaculate. His posture was perfect. His face was composed and unreadable. But his eyes looked like they belonged to a dead man. The operations room fell into absolute silence as Yamamoto returned. Every officer snapped to attention. The air felt thick, suffocating electric with anticipation. They were waiting for orders, waiting for the brilliant counterattack, waiting for the strategic masterstroke that would turn this disaster into victory. Yamamoto had never failed them before. Surely he had a plan. The Admiral walked slowly to the large operational map spread across the central table. He stared at it for a long moment. The miniature ship markers, the plotted positions, the arrows indicating fleet movements, all of it suddenly meaningless. When Yamamoto finally spoke, his voice was eerily calm, almost gentle. Japan has lost the war. The words fell like stones into still water. For several seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. They couldn't have heard that correctly. The Admiral, their commander, the man who had delivered victory after victory, couldn't have just said what they thought he said. Captain Kuroshima, one of Yamamoto's most trusted strategists, took a half step forward. Admiral, with respect, we still have 6 battleships in this task force alone. We have heavy cruisers, destroyers, submarines. The Americans are wounded. If we pursue them now, Yamamoto raised one hand slightly. The gesture was subtle, but it silenced Kuroshima immediately. We have lost the strategic initiative, Yamamoto continued. His voice remained steady, factual, almost clinical. We will never recover it. Every calculation, every operational plan, every assumption upon which this war was built depended on maintaining carrier superiority in the Pacific. He looked around the room, met the eyes of his officers one by one. Those 4 carriers cannot be replaced. Not in 6 months, not in a year, not in 2 years. America's industrial capacity will produce 10 carriers for every one we can build. Their pilots will train in safety while ours. He paused. While ours die learning to land on ships that no longer exist. The brutal honesty was shocking. In Japanese military culture, such defeatist talk was not just discouraged. It was dangerous. Officers had been court-martialed for less, but Yamamoto wasn't panicking. He wasn't being emotional or dramatic. He was stating mathematical reality, the cold, hard numbers that no amount of courage or fighting spirit could overcome. The war, he said quietly, is over. We simply haven't finished losing it yet. What made Yamamoto's words even more chilling was this. He had predicted this exact disaster months before it happened. December 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor. While all of Japan celebrated their greatest military triumph, while newspapers printed triumphant headlines, and the emperor himself praised the attack, while the entire nation believed America would sue for peace within months, Yamamoto sat in a private meeting with Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and delivered a warning that would be ignored, dismissed, and ultimately proven devastatingly accurate. I can run wild for 6 months, Yamamoto told the Prime Minister. His voice was measured, careful. Perhaps a year if fortune favors us. After that, I guarantee nothing. Tojo leaned forward. What do you mean, Admiral? You've just delivered the greatest victory in our nation's history. The American fleet is destroyed. Their morale is shattered. Their fleet is damaged. Yamamoto corrected. Their carriers were not in Pearl Harbor. And morale. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I lived in America for 2 years, Prime Minister. I studied at Harvard. I traveled from coast to coast. I saw their factories, their resources, their industrial capacity. He pulled out a piece of paper with calculations he'd worked through the night before. America can produce 3 times the steel we can, 5 times the oil, 10 times the aircraft. If this war becomes a contest of industrial production, of attrition, of who can replace losses faster, we cannot possibly win. Tojo's expression hardened. Then we must win quickly, before they can mobilize. Yes, Yamamoto agreed, which is why the carriers are everything. They are our only advantage, our only weapon capable of projecting power faster than America can respond. If we lose those carriers, if they are sunk or damaged beyond repair. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The Prime Minister stood. You worry too much, Admiral. You've become too Western in your thinking. Have faith in the Japanese spirit. Our warriors are superior to theirs. Our cause is just. After Tojo left, Yamamoto remained in the room for a long time. He looked out the window toward the Tokyo skyline. Somewhere in the distance, celebrations continued. People danced in the streets. Children waved flags. The whole nation believed they were invincible. Yamamoto picked up his pen and wrote a single sentence in his personal diary. I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve. Now, exactly 6 months and 2 days after that conversation, after that ignored warning, Yamamoto's prediction had become reality. The carriers were gone. The strategic initiative was lost, and the giant was very much awake. The news reached Tokyo at 8:15 p.m. Japan time. Imperial Navy headquarters. A fortress-like building in the heart of the capital erupted into chaos. Admirals gathered in emergency session. Some pounded their fists on tables and demanded immediate counterattack. Others argued for a complete withdrawal of all Pacific forces. Junior officers ran between rooms carrying revised situation reports that seemed to contradict each other every 10 minutes. But beneath the shouting and the confusion, a more delicate problem was taking shape. The emperor had to be told. In Japanese military and political culture, this was an extraordinarily sensitive matter. You did not simply walk into the imperial palace and announce catastrophic defeat. There were protocols, traditions, carefully choreographed ways of delivering bad news that softened the blow, made it seem less devastating. Preserved face for everyone involved. Navy Minister Admiral Shigetaro Shimada drew the terrible duty. He put on his most formal uniform, composed his words carefully, rehearsed his tone until it struck the perfect balance between respectful concern and cautious optimism. At 9:30 p.m., he was ushered into the emperor's private chambers. Emperor Hirohito sat behind a simple desk. His face was, as always, nearly impossible to read. Decades of imperial training had taught him to show no emotion. No surprise, no anger, nothing that might be interpreted as a political statement. Shimada bowed deeply, then delivered his carefully prepared statement. Your Majesty, our forces have engaged the American fleet near Midway Island. The battle was intense. Some of our carriers sustained damage during tactical operations. The situation is still developing. Our commanders are assessing options for continued engagement. He had avoided the word lost. He had avoided the word sunk. He had made it sound like a temporary setback in an ongoing operation. The emperor listened in silence. When Shimada finished, there was a long pause. Then Hirohito asked a single, devastatingly simple question. How many carriers remain operational in the task force, Admiral? Shimada felt his throat go dry. There was no way to soften this. No protocol that could make the truth sound better. None, Your Majesty. The emperor's face revealed nothing. Not shock, not anger, not grief, nothing. He simply nodded once, slowly. Thank you, Admiral. Please keep me informed as the situation develops. Then, with the subtlest gesture, he indicated that Shimada should leave, that he wished to be alone. After the Navy minister departed, Emperor Hirohito sat at his desk for a long time. Historians and palace staff would later speculate endlessly about what he did in that moment. Did he weep? Did he pray? Did he rage against the fate that had befallen his nation? No one knows. The emperor never spoke of it. Not then, not ever. But what Tokyo Command decided to do next? The choice they made in those desperate hours would poison Japan's war effort more thoroughly than any bomb. Within 24 hours of the Battle of Midway, the Imperial Japanese government made a decision that was as stunning as it was tragic. They decided to lie, not to the Americans, not to the international press, but to their own people. On June 6, just 2 days after the disaster, Japanese newspapers across the nation printed nearly identical headlines. Glorious victory at Midway. Enemy fleet destroyed. TWO American carriers sunk. The articles described heroic aerial attacks. Brave pilots pressing home their assaults against superior numbers. American ships fleeing in disarray. Japanese losses described as light and acceptable. There were photographs of smiling aviators giving victory salutes. Interviews with eyewitnesses describing the battle in triumphant terms. Even a staged ceremony where the emperor supposedly congratulated the Midway Task Force. All of it, every word, every image completely fabricated. The truth was immediately classified as a state secret of the highest order. The survivors from the 4 sunken carriers. The pilots who had watched their ships burn. The sailors who had floated in the oil-slicked water for hours before being rescued. They were quietly isolated in special barracks on remote bases. They couldn't write letters home, couldn't speak to other units, couldn't tell anyone, not even their closest friends, what had actually happened. Officers who knew the truth were pulled into closed-door meetings, reminded that military secrets were sacred, that loose talk endangered the war effort, that speaking openly about Midway would be considered treason. The threat was never explicitly stated. It didn't need to be. One junior naval lieutenant, a man named Tanaka, apparently told his wife what he had witnessed at Midway, described the carriers burning, mentioned the catastrophic losses. 3 days later, he disappeared. Military police came to his home, took him away. His wife never saw him again. His children never learned what happened to their father. The message was clear: silence or consequences. But why? Why would Japanese command go to such extreme lengths to hide a military defeat? Nations lose battles. It happens. Surely the Japanese people could handle the truth? The answer reveals something deeply troubling about how Tokyo Command viewed its own population and about the impossible trap they had created for themselves. The cover-up of Midway wasn't just about maintaining morale. It was about maintaining the fundamental lie upon which the entire war effort was built. Since December 1941, the Japanese people had been told they were destined to win, that their military was invincible, that every battle brought them closer to final victory. The government had staked everything politically, psychologically, spiritually on the narrative of inevitable triumph. To admit that 4 irreplaceable carriers had been lost, that Japan's offensive power was crippled, that the strategic initiative had shifted to America would be to admit that the war might be lost. And if the war might be lost, then what was the point of the rationing? The sacrifices? The death notices arriving at homes across the nation? What meaning could be found in all that suffering if victory wasn't certain? Tokyo Command feared this admission more than they feared American bombs. They feared their own people losing faith, losing the will to continue fighting, demanding negotiations, demanding peace. So they lied. And the lie created a cascade of catastrophic consequences. Because the cover-up meant Tokyo couldn't change strategy. They couldn't acknowledge that the situation had fundamentally shifted. They couldn't order a defensive consolidation of forces. They couldn't tell factories to prioritize carrier construction above all else. Officially, nothing had gone wrong. So why change anything? For months after Midway, Japan continued attacking, pushing forward, launching new offensives, acting as though they still held the strategic advantage they had lost on June 4th. American intelligence officers watched in disbelief. They had broken Japanese codes. They knew Tokyo understood what had happened at Midway. But Japan's military decisions made no sense. They were spreading forces too thin, attacking marginal targets, failing to defend critical positions. Admiral Raymond Spruance, one of the American commanders at Midway, reviewed Japanese fleet movements in August 1942 and remarked to his staff, "It's as if they don't realize they're losing, as if no one told them what happened." And in a tragic sense, he was right, because the cover-up had created confusion within Japan's own military command structure. Mid-level officers were making tactical decisions based on false information, planning operations that assumed carrier support that no longer existed, allocating resources according to strategic priorities that were now completely obsolete. The lie had metastasized, spread through the entire system like poison, and at the center of it, all knowing the truth but powerless to speak it, sat Admiral Yamamoto. After Midway, Yamamoto never spoke publicly about the battle again. To do so would be to contradict the official narrative, to risk being labeled defeatist, possibly even treasonous. So he buried his knowledge, threw himself into planning the next operations, tried desperately to salvage anything from the disaster, tried to find some tactical brilliance that could compensate for the strategic collapse he knew was coming. But privately, to his closest aide, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, Yamamoto revealed the depth of his despair. It was late October 1942, 4 months after Midway. American forces had landed on Guadalcanal and were slowly, painfully, grinding down Japanese positions there. The Naval General Staff was demanding aggressive counterattacks, insisting that Japan could still win decisively if commanders just showed enough fighting spirit. Yamamoto and Watanabe were alone in the Admiral's cabin aboard the Yamato. The evening was quiet, peaceful, almost serene. "Do you know what frightens me most, Watanabe?" Yamamoto asked suddenly. His aide looked up. The Admiral rarely spoke so openly. "It's not the Americans," Yamamoto continued. "I respect them. I fear their strength, but I understand them." He paused, took a slow breath. "What frightens me is that we are still marching toward the cliff and no one will stop walking." Watanabe said nothing. What could he say? "Tokyo knows the truth," Yamamoto went on. "The Naval General Staff knows we lost at Midway. They read the same reports I do. They see the same casualty figures. They understand the mathematics as well as I do. But they cannot admit it. Not to the people. Not to the Emperor. Not even to themselves. So they order us to keep attacking. Keep advancing. Keep pretending we're winning." He looked out the porthole at the dark Pacific Ocean. "We are passengers on a train heading for a collapsed bridge," he said quietly. "Everyone aboard knows the bridge is out, but no one will pull the emergency brake. Because pulling the brake would be admitting the bridge is gone." Watanabe later wrote that he had never heard such profound resignation in a senior officer's voice. "So what do we do, Admiral?" he asked. Yamamoto smiled sadly. "We keep fighting. We do our duty. We try to minimize the casualties when the end finally comes. And we hope," he paused, "we hope that history will understand we did our best with an impossible situation." April 18, 1943. American codebreakers intercepted a message detailing Admiral Yamamoto's inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The schedule was precise, the flight path predictable, the aircraft he'd be traveling in clearly identified. It was an opportunity too valuable to pass up. President Roosevelt himself approved the mission. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters took off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Their orders were explicit: intercept and destroy Yamamoto's aircraft. At 7:43 a.m., high above the jungles of Bougainville Island, American fighters spotted 2 Japanese bombers escorted by 60 fighters. One of those bombers carried Admiral Yamamoto. The dogfight was brief, vicious, decisive. Multiple machine gun bullets ripped through the bomber's fuselage. One struck Yamamoto in the left shoulder. Another entered behind his ear and exited through his right eye. The Admiral died instantly, still strapped into his seat, still wearing the ceremonial sword his father had given him decades earlier. The bomber crashed into the jungle. It took Japanese search parties nearly a day to reach the wreckage. When they finally found Yamamoto's body, he was still upright in his seat, his hand gripping his sword, his face locked in an expression that witnesses described as almost peaceful, as if death had been a release. Tokyo announced his death with great ceremony, called him a hero, a martyr, a symbol of Japanese fighting spirit. But they never mentioned what he had said after Midway, never acknowledged his warnings, never admitted that he had predicted Japan's defeat more than a year before his death and had been proven correct in every detail. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radio speakers across Japan. His speech was formal, stilted, filled with euphemisms and careful phrasing designed to soften the unbearable. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Lost. Finished. In homes and factories and military bases across the nation. People listened in stunned silence. Many wept. Some couldn't process what they were hearing. After years of being told victory was certain, after being assured that Japan was winning, after sacrificing everything for the promised triumph, defeat seemed impossible. In the days and weeks that followed, as occupation forces arrived and censorship lifted, as newspapers began publishing actual facts instead of propaganda, the Japanese people learned the truth about the war for the first time, including the truth about Midway. 3 years. It had taken 3 years for them to learn what had really happened on June 4, 1942. 3 years of being told they were winning. 3 years of sending sons and husbands and brothers to die for a cause that was already lost. The betrayal was profound, unforgivable. How many lives could have been saved if Tokyo had admitted defeat in 1942? If they had sued for peace before the firebombing of Japanese cities? Before Iwo Jima and Okinawa? Before the atomic bombs? We'll never know. But the number is staggering. The words that echo still. So what did Japanese high command really say when they realized Midway was lost? Admiral Yamamoto said it plainly. Japan has lost the war. But to the emperor, they softened it. Some carriers were damaged. To the people, they lied completely. Glorious victory. Enemy fleet destroyed. And to themselves, in the quiet moments when no one else was listening, they whispered the truth they couldn't bear to speak aloud. The Battle of Midway wasn't just a military defeat. It was a moment of moral collapse. A point where Japan's leadership chose deception over truth, chose the comfort of lies over the pain of reality. And that choice, that fundamental betrayal of their own people, might have killed more Japanese than any bomb or bullet ever did. Because when you lie about losing a battle, you trap yourself into fighting a war you cannot win. When you hide defeat from your own people, you doom them to suffer defeat after defeat after defeat, never understanding why the sacrifices never bring victory. Tokyo Command's reaction to Midway sealed Japan's fate, not because they lost 4 carriers, but because they refused to admit they'd lost them. The secret wasn't what happened at Midway. The secret was that everyone in power knew. And no one would tell the truth, and that silence, that calculated, deliberate deception, echoes still in the history books. A warning about the deadly price of lies. A reminder that sometimes the truth, no matter how terrible, is the only thing that can save you from something far worse. The end.